As I discussed in my program yesterday, we've now had a flurry of articles in the Western media which confirm that Ukraine's grip on Bakhmut, this strategically important town in Donbass, well, I think it's strategically important that Ukraine's grip on Bakhmut is now apparently slipping. And we've had a further report now in the Wall Street Journal, a newspaper I don't subscribe to, which essentially says the same thing, that Ukraine is in the process of losing Bakhmut, that there is only one main road left into the town. From what I can gather, this is the road that's been referred to is the road that passes through Ivanivka, which is this village to the west of Bakhmut, a place which the Russians call Krasnoye, and which is now in the early stages of attack by the Russian military. When I say the Russian military, I wish to make it clear that what I mean is, of course, the Wagner organization and its assault troops. Now, we've had a flurry of reports now from the Russian side which confirm all of this, and these reports appear in all sorts of places, but as is usually the case, I will quote Russian officials, actual Russian officials, describing the situation in Bakhmut. And I'm going to start with Denis Pushilin, who is the acting head of the government of the Donetsk People's Republic. And Pushilin has given another long interview to Russia 24 television, that's a Russian television channel. And this is what the official Russian news agency TASS reports him as having said, at least one of the cluster of reports from TASS, which I'm now going to read. Denis Pushilin, the interim head of the Donetsk People's Republic, on Monday said Russian forces are moving ahead at the key spots in Artyomovsk. Artyomovsk is, of course, the name the Russians give to the town, which I will for the moment continue to refer to as Bakhmut. I will continue to call it Bakhmut so long as the Ukrainians still remain in possession of it. But anyway, to continue what Pushilin says, but operational encirclement of Ukrainian forces hadn't been achieved yet. It's too early to talk about operational encirclement of Artyomovsk. Fierce battles are ongoing. Wagner assault troops continue to operate there on a daily basis, day and night. In some places there are trench clashes, but we are seeing movement forward at key spots. And then TASS quotes Pushilin as saying battles are now taking place on the outskirts of the town, in the neighborhoods that were held by Ukrainian troops just recently. The Donetsk and Lugansk militias have said repeatedly that Ukraine is moving reserves to the Artyomovsk area, where its forces are suffering substantial losses. Now, the last perhaps is a response to some reports that I saw, some unconfirmed reports that I saw last night, that Ukraine was in the process of beginning some kind of withdrawal from Bakhmut. We know that this is the advice that the United States has given to Ukraine, and we have, as I said, information from, amongst other places, the Wall Street Journal, that there's only one supply line left to Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut, the one that passes through Ivanivka. And the United States has warned Ukraine that it should pull its troops out of Bakhmut, and we see that the Russians appear to be working towards an encirclement of Bakhmut. And Pushilin says that encirclement hasn't yet happened, but that it is apparently, from the tone of his words, now very close. Well, there's been no sign this morning that I can see of any Ukrainian withdrawal from Bakhmut. something which, by the way, I find a little surprising, but there we are. And we have another report, also from Pushilin, and again, I'm reading it from TASS. Cutting off the Ukrainian army's supplies along the road from Chasov Yar to Artyomovsk, and then TASS helpfully tells us that Artyomovsk is called Bakhmut in Ukraine, is a priority for Russian forces. Acting head of the Donetsk People's Republic, Denis Pushilin, said on Monday. Now, Chasov Yar is a town, small town to the west of Bakhmut. It is the town through which a lot of the supplies to Bakhmut are funneled. This is the town which one of the roads from Chasov Yar is the road that leads through Ivanivka or Krasnoye, if you prefer, and it is this road which is the remaining road, as far as I can see, that the Wall Street Journal is talking about as the only remaining supply point left to the Ukrainian troops trying to defend themselves in Bakhmut. Anyway, this is what TASS quotes Pushilin as saying. For us, it is important to cut off the Chasov Yar Artyomovsk road as one of the few remaining supply routes for the enemy's battle group. And we've also had a further report. This is from another, well, actually, he's an ex-Russian official. He is Lieutenant Colonel Andrei Marochko, who TASS tells us is a retired colonel of the militia of the Lugansk People's Republic. And he says that so far from retreating from these areas, Ukraine is trying to reinforce. And he says, this is the TASS report, Ukrainian units have been erecting fortifications and preparing additional firing points near Chasov Yar in the Donetsk People's Republic. According to Marochko, reconnaissance has been recording work to strengthen the positions. Ukraine's armed formations have been reinforcing old fortifications and building new ones, and work is underway to create firing points and place minefields. Ukraine is also deploying additional forces over there. So, Ukraine is disregarding the advice it's getting from the United States. It's deciding to try to cling on to Bakhmut for as long as it can. Ukrainian officials, including Zelensky and his defense minister, Mr. Reznikov, have both said that the situation in eastern Ukraine is becoming very acute and very difficult. But nonetheless, despite all of these problems, all of these pressures, they still seem to be determined to try to make the fight in Bakhmut last as long as possible. I have to say, I do wonder what people in the Pentagon are making of all of this. The fact that Ukraine is being given this advice by the United States, by the United States military, from which, of course, it receives all this equipment, all this ammunition, all these new weapons. It's just been received a promise for 31 Abrams tanks, for example. But nonetheless, despite getting all this advice, it's deciding to make a stand at Bakhmut, committing more and more forces to Bakhmut, despite the now universal acknowledgement from Western sources that Bakhmut is going to be lost, despite the enormously heavy losses Ukraine is suffering, defending Bakhmut, and despite the fact that the German intelligence agency, the BND, has now actually reported to the Bundestag that Ukraine is losing soldiers to the number of 3 figures every day, trying to defend Bakhmut, which almost certainly will soon be lost. It does seem all to me extremely strange, but clearly that's what Ukraine has chosen to do. Anyway, That's the situation in Bakhmut. And we now also get reports from other from Pushilin about other battlefronts. And this is again a report from Pushilin made over the course of the same television program, Russia 24. Pushilin is reported as saying the following: Russian forces have established a presence in the eastern parts of Vuhledar. Well, he's now referring to Vuhledar, this town in the southern Donetsk region. And he says fighting is underway near the town. Our units continue their advance towards Vuhledar. We can say now that the units have gained a foothold in Vuhledar's east, and work is underway in its outskirts too. It is too early to say when Vuhledar could be taken under Russian troops' control because the enemy has not yet been given instructions to retreat and it has had the time to establish itself in the town. And in fact, we've been getting a whole host of reports from multiple other sources about the situation in Vuhledar. And these reports suggest that the Russians are gradually, incrementally repeating the strategy that they followed in places like Soledar and Mariupol before that, and Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which they're now following in Bakhmut, which is to maintain constant pressure on Ukrainian forces located inside a town, but rather than attack head on, they're gradually capturing the villages and settlements around a town. They're shelling the main communications lines. They're engaging Ukraine in a battle of attrition. And eventually, of course, once Ukrainian forces are cut off from resupply, they will move in and capture the place. And usually, up to now, the pattern has been that when we get to that last stage of a battle, it's concluded very quickly. So that seems to be the case in Vuhledar. Further east, by the way, we've also had reports that the Russians have now strengthened their positions around the towns of Orekhov and Gulyapolye in Zaporozhye region. And my own feeling here is that perhaps if the Russians do decide to advance and try to capture these places, which is not inconceivable, then that will provide, if you like, the launching point for a major offensive by the Russian military in Zaporozhye region. That might be something that the Russians are planning for the spring, but that the primary purpose of these advances, which we have seen in Zaporozhye region, is to prevent Ukrainian forces in Zaporozhye region reinforcing Ukrainian positions in Vuhledar. It is Vuhledar which the Russians are primarily focused upon at present. And I think that this is in Vuhledar, in southern Donbass, that's the key battle that's now being fought in the southern front, even as Bakhmut is the main battle that's being fought on the eastern front, if you like, over the course of what has been over the course of this war. So that, it seems to me, is the situation as of the time of making of these programs on the battlefields. There's still heavy artillery exchanges across the Dnieper River in Kherson region, but clearly no movement of forces there. Ukraine has occasionally sought to carry out raids across the Dnieper, but the Russians say that all of those raids have been unsuccessful. And there also are constant clashes in the Svatovo Kremenaya area, but Ukraine has failed to mount any successful attacks in that area. The main battles are now happening in Bakhmut and in Vuhledar, and certainly the battle in Bakhmut appears to be drawing towards its crisis, its major point, when Bakhmut is eventually captured by the Russians and the Ukrainian forces, both in the town and around the town, are either encircled by the Russians or engage in some kind of retreat before that final encirclement takes place. So that, so far as I can see, is the situation on the battlefronts this morning. A steadily deteriorating picture for Ukraine in Bakhmut, in Vuhledar, Ukraine continuing to suffer very heavy losses, continuing to engage the Russians in a war of attrition, despite the Pentagon's advice, and the Russians steadily making incremental gains. Before I leave this topic of this fighting in Bakhmut and Vuhledar, I would advise everybody to go to the new Atlas and see Brian Balletic's latest video. There he discusses the account of the fighting in Bakhmut by a Australian soldier, Australian volunteer, who is based or has been based in and around Bakhmut, fighting on the Ukrainian side. And Brian Balletic gives a masterly account of what this person is saying, and that both confirms that the fighting in Bakhmut is going very badly for Ukraine, and interestingly, that Ukraine's offensive in Kherson region, about which we were hearing so much a few weeks ago, was a strategic failure. That's a very interesting program, and I would urge everybody to go and see it. So we can see that overall the military situation in Ukraine is becoming increasingly bleak, and Ukraine, far from taking steps to remedy the fact, seems on the contrary to be trying to dig in to hold on to its positions in Donbass, something which of course begs many, many questions. But let's take a step back and look at the question of what the Western powers are doing in response to all of this. Now, I've discussed in recent programs how there does appear to be a division of views within the United States about the wisdom of continuing the war in Ukraine. We had a recent report from the Rand Corporation, which made it fairly clear that the United States would gain nothing by a prolongation of the war in Ukraine. On the contrary, it would be dangerous for the United States. It would increase escalatory risks. It would make the US position, ultimately, it could make the US position increasingly precarious globally, and it might also, it carries also the risk of an uncontrolled escalation in conditions which might be disastrous for the United States. We've also had a report from the CSIS, which talks about how the overall condition of the US military, its industrial base, has been shown up by the war in Ukraine to be unfit for purpose, that the United States is rapidly depleting its stocks, that it's running out of ammunition to supply to Ukraine, and that it's becoming it's finding itself in a situation where its overall military position global position is becoming increasingly fragile because of the overcommitment of forces, overcommitment of resources to Ukraine. And it's becoming increasingly clear that this is also the view of various military officers in Europe. They too are becoming increasingly worried about how the supply of equipment, Western military equipment to Ukraine, is depleting NATO arsenals in Europe, exposing NATO in Europe to all sorts of potential difficulties in the event that there is an escalation of the crisis in Europe and that the European powers need to take steps to defend themselves. Well, I've discussed comments by two German generals, General Kuyat and General Fad, which basically talk about the fragile condition of the German Bundeswehr. There have been complaints about this from the German officers, the Bundeswehr's officers union. They've been saying that transferring military equipment to Ukraine at this time is simply weakening the Bundeswehr. It's not strengthening Germany's positions, German military's position. It's weakening Germany. It's not strengthening Germany in any significant way. We've also seen an article, there's also been an article in The Economist, which says that the condition of the German armed forces is deplorable and is deteriorating, and that the transfer of tanks to Ukraine is going to make that condition even worse. And we can see that in Britain, similar comments are being said. Now, this article appeared on Sky News on the 16th of January, and it's in Britain. It comes from Britain, and it says sending Ukraine tanks weakens UK forces, says British Army's top general. And it quotes at length comments made by General Sir Patrick Sanders, who is the overall commander of the British Army. And these were said in private to British military, to the British soldiers, but Sky News was provided with a copy. At least they saw these comments that British General Sanders made, and of course General Sanders is very careful outwardly to support the government's policies. He says that he supports the transfer of tanks to Ukraine, but he does go on to say giving away these capabilities will leave us temporarily weaker as an army. There is no denying it. And there is no doubt that our choice will impact on our ability to mobilize the army against the acute and enduring threat Russia presents and meet our NATO obligations. Our tank crews and gunners will feel the impact most, but the decision also brings the opportunity to accelerate the modernization and transformation of the army ahead of Russia. So what Sanders is saying is, at the moment, sending 14 Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine is only going to make the British military weaker. Hopefully, one day we will get replacements for these tanks, and that will mean that we will get more money, funding for the military, and that will put us in a better position going forward. And in the meantime, of course, it's our duty, our moral obligation, and our security, and in the interest of our own security, to support Ukraine. But in the meantime, our military position is deteriorating. And of course, that's General Sanders' view. But now we've had a further report from Sky News, which tells us how bad the situation of the British military actually is. And this report from Sky News tells us that these concerns are also shared by the United States. The US military has been reviewing the state of the British armed forces, and an American general has told the British that as far as the United States is concerned, Britain at the moment cannot be considered a first-tier military power comparable to the United States, China, and Russia. And we are told that this is, I'm reading now from Sky News, the armed forces would run out of ammunition in a few days if called upon to fight. The UK lacks the ability to defend its skies against the level of missile and drone strikes that Ukraine is enduring. It would take 5 to 10 years for the army to be able to field a warfighting division of some 25 to 30,000 troops backed by tanks, artillery, and helicopters. I would say that Ukraine, according to some estimates, is losing that equivalent of troops, 25 to 30,000, in a 2 to 3 month period. It's already lost multiples of the size of this British division, which it would take the British 5 to 10 years to put together. And then the report goes on to say some 30% of British forces on high readiness are reservists who are unable to mobilise within NATO timelines, and as a result, the British Army would turn up under strength to any battle, and the majority of the Army's field of armoured vehicles, including tanks, including, by the way, Challenger 2 tanks, was built between 30 to 60 years ago, and full replacements are not due for years. So the German army is in a bad state, the British army is in a bad state. Neither country, neither Germany nor Britain, at the moment have any plans to change that or to make it better. But in the meantime, both are shipping weapons to Ukraine. They're weakening their overall military position, even as the United States military, the mighty United States military, far more powerful than Germany and Britain, there is also depleting its reserve stocks and is finding itself short of things like 155mm ammunition, and, by the way, HIMARS missiles and Patriot surface-to-air missiles and those sort of things. In other words, Ukraine is becoming a drain. It is weakening the overall Western military position. And this is not something that is just being said by me or by Brian Beletic on the new Atlas. We now see the Rand Corporation, the CSIS, General Sir Patrick Sanders saying it about Britain, and of course the military in Germany are saying it too, and the Economist is also saying it about the military in Germany as well. And there are currently no plans, no realistic or feasible plans about how to turn this round. So it's not surprising that the military are getting concerned. And in the case of the American military, there is, I suspect, a particularly acute cause of concern. Now, American commanders, American military people, people like General Milley, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of those sort of people, it's important to say that they've not suddenly transformed into pacifists. In the case of the American military, it's become increasingly clear to me that their major area of strategic priority is not Russia, it is China. And that from the perspective of the US military high command, Ukraine is a massive exercise in diversion from the main area of the battle. Now, there's recently been a long article on NBC in which it's discussed how China became much more powerful during the period of the so-called War on Terror, the series of wars that the United States engaged in the Middle East after the 9/11 attacks, the ones in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in, Libya, the proxy war in Syria, all of those places, that the Chinese took advantage of the extent to which the United States was distracted by these wars, the way in which the US military position was altered and strategically changed to wage these wars, and that China, over the course of this period, its economy grew tenfold in size and its armed forces developed to exceptionally greater levels than had been the case back before 2001. And this same article makes the point that in the run-up to 9/11, the major strategic focus of the United States had in fact been China. There'd been a number of incidents. There'd been an incident involving a Chinese fighter jet and an American surveillance aircraft that was landed by the Chinese in Hainan Island and taken apart by the Chinese there. And that the United States would have been focused on China if 9/11 and all that in the Middle East had not happened. Now, that may be true, by the way, or it may not be true, but this is a narrative that is certainly gaining very strong hold in the United States. Many people believe that, and one senses that there are people in the military who think that as well. And now we've had comments by a US military leader, I believe General Minihan, who is a member of the US Air Force, a commander of the US Air Force, and he talks about the possibility of the United States being at war with China by 2025, in other words, in 2 years' time. And we've had other reports from other US officials also talking about a potential war with China. Now, if you are a US military commander, if you are a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, if you are, in other words, General Minihan, or US admirals, or US Navy secretaries, all of whom have been talking about potential conflicts with China, well, if you believe that the United States got diverted from the key conflict area, the real place where the battle lines of the 21st century will be fought, which is the Pacific region, if you really think that that was what the War on Terror did, it took America's eye off the ball so that they weren't able to focus on China. Well, how much more concerned must you be by the fact that you're now seeing your precious assets being depleted at an astronomical rate in the war in Ukraine? You're losing your artillery stocks, you're losing your HIMARS missile stocks, you're at risk of losing your Patriot missile stocks, you're seeing your allies depleting their tanks, their tank forces. You're being pushed into sending some of your own tanks there as well. There's now talk of sending fighter jets, all this equipment that logically you should be basing in the Pacific, you're having to send to Europe, to Ukraine instead, where it just gets burnt out by the Russians at warp speed. And it's perhaps not surprising that US military commanders, some military officers, are beginning to get worried about this. And if you are a US military commander, well, you're probably not so very interested at the moment in confronting Russia. But given that your priority is China and that you're presumably not interested, at least for the time being, in coming to any kind of rapprochement with the Russians, what you need is to have your European allies with strong militaries so that they can withstand the Russians, even as you focus on the Chinese instead. And what's happening? Well, the opposite. We see the British shipping their tanks to Ukraine, with even the head of the British Army, General coming along and saying, General Saunders coming along and saying, well, that's actually going to weaken us as an army. We see the same in Germany. It's getting even worse there. The Germans were talking a few months ago about increasing defense spending and engaging in a huge military build-up. That idea seems to have gone down in smoke. There's now reports that Germany might actually be in economic recession, so that probably isn't going to happen. And if you're a US military commander who wants the NATO allies strong and ready to take on the Russians whilst the United States deals with the Chinese, well, you must be becoming increasingly worried about the way things are shaping out in this war in Ukraine. And perhaps that's entirely understandable thinking. And I'm going to suggest that it is this which is driving the misgivings that we're seeing coming out of the military at the moment. It's why we see the United States military opposing deliveries of Abrams tanks to Ukraine, why people like General Milley are talking about the need for a diplomatic compromise with the Russians, why the Rand Corporation is coming up with reports like the one that I discussed a few days ago, why the CSIS is flashing the red lights about the state of US army stocks and the state of the US military industrial complex. And all of this, by the way, brings me back to a whole series of programs that I did long before this war began. If you go far back enough on this channel, you will find them, in which I spoke about how the United States is risking finding itself in a commitments crisis, trying to take on the Chinese and the Russians, and by the way, the Iranians and the North Koreans and all sorts of others, all at one and the same time, even though the industrial capacity of the United States' opponents greatly exceeds its own. Something which is new to the United States and which I think American policymakers and the American public have not yet faced up to. And I said that rather than confront all of these opponents, the Chinese, the Russians especially, but also perhaps the North Koreans and the Iranians, what the United States needed to do was try to work towards some kind of geostrategic ceasefire with all, or most, or at least some of them, trying to reduce the amount of commitments it had to make, go back to what it did back in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when the United States went over to seeking a policy of détente with the Soviet Union and opening up to China in order basically to catch its breath after the debacle in Vietnam. And I said that this would be the right policy for the United States to pursue. And we see how that commitment crisis that I talked about is now here, only it's evolving far more rapidly than I ever imagined, with Western equipment being burnt up at, as I said, warp speed in Ukraine, with the United States and its European allies trying to play catch up with Ukrainian needs, even as their own industrial base is under increasing stress and even as the Chinese and, by the way, the Russian build-ups now continue. Well, I have to say straight away that I think that the counsels of people like General Minihan, who are talking about war with China by 2025, would be every bit as disastrous as what we've seen in Ukraine. I think the idea that the United States should engage in a conflict with China over Taiwan is a massive mistake, would be a disastrous mistake, worse even than the conflict that the United States has found itself in with the Russians in Ukraine. And the Chinese are picking up on this, and there's been a very stern and powerful editorial in Global Times, and Global Times being, of course, a newspaper which is the unofficial English language voice of the Chinese government. And I'm going to read extracts from it because I think it gives a good insight into Chinese thinking. And it says the US media outlets reported that General Michael A. Minihan, who is head of Air Mobility Command, oversees the Air Force's fleet of transport and refueling aircraft, blatantly predicted in a memo that the United States could be at war with China over Taiwan 2 years from now. Such bombastic words startled the Pentagon and prompted Pentagon officials to clarify immediately that these comments are not representative of the department's view on China, which means the remarks only represent Minihan's own views. But from the outside world, the incident is not as simple as it appears. Minihan is a big mouth. The US media described him as being known for incendiary speech, particularly about China. But he is not that special or rare within the US military. Similar voices have emerged one after another in the past few years, and they are all quite important people in the US military. Navy Admiral Charles Richard, commander of US Strategic Command, said in November at a conference that the Ukraine crisis is just the warm-up and the big one is coming, referring to a war with China. These intimidating predictions about an imminent war between China and the United States are all similar, while the only difference is the time. Minihan's gut told him that China and the US will fight within 2 years, which brings the time forward and creates an even more urgent atmosphere than Commander of the US Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Philip Davidson, when testifying before the US Senate Armed Services Committee, claimed that China may try to attack Taiwan by 2027. The timing has been cited by some security analysts as the Davidson window. However, apparently none of these predictions is reliable. However, we cannot regard these as just ravings. Combined with the actual actions and deployment adjustments of the US military in the Asia-Pacific region, we see substantive subtexts from these babblings. And the US military may have the intention of stimulating and deterring the Chinese mainland by talking big, but it is indeed making real preparations for a possible military conflict between China and the United States, including intervention in the Taiwan Straits to prevent China's reunification. What Minihan said in his memo is not simply from his gut, it represents the real attitude of some people in the United States military. Behind Washington's frequent military deployments in the Asia-Pacific region under the banner of peace, such belligerent forces are fermenting. So the Chinese are coming to the view that the United States is preparing for war against them. That is going to accelerate their own build-up to respond to what they see as this US military challenge. It also, if you take a step back and think about it, means that from a Chinese point of view, it actually makes sense to keep the United States bogged down in Ukraine. So not only will the Chinese quietly assist the Russians in a diplomatic and economic way, but if the Russians do ever start to run short of anything, well, you can see that there is now an incentive for the Chinese, with their colossal manufacturing capacity, to make up the difference. So I think that's a fact which perhaps some people in the West might bear in mind. The Russians show no sign at the moment of running out of shells or missiles, but were they ever to do so, given that the Chinese feel that the Americans are coming for them in the Pacific, they now have an incentive, or so it seems to me, to make sure that any problems with supply of military equipment are made up. Now, this is an extremely dangerous situation all round, and I think it's worth making the point that even as the Pentagon apparently is trying to the extent that it can to de-escalate in Europe with the Russians, to bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end, doesn't mean, if that happens, that things will become easier globally. We could very well easily find ourselves in a few years' time in an even bigger conflict in the Pacific. But one can also perhaps understand from this some of the shrillness and hysteria about this conflict on the part of some people in Europe. If you are Poland and the Baltic states and some of the other leaders across Europe who take an extremely strong anti-Russian position, then your concern must be to deal the Russians some kind of knockout blow soon, because given concerns in the Pentagon, given the fact that the Pentagon is looking towards China, looking towards the Pacific, there is a real possibility that in a few years' time, the US will have redeployed or at least reduced its commitment to Europe, will no longer be seeking some kind of decisive outcome in Europe, because its major commitment will be against China and against the Pacific region. So if you're Poland, if you're the Baltic states, if you still entertain dreams of using American power to achieve your long-standing fixation to break up Russia, to break up what you call the Russian Empire, then the time to do that is now. Because in a few years' time, America may no longer be there to help you do it, because it's concerned, involved with China instead, and your time window for achieving your plans is small and closing. Now, all of this, as I said, all of this talk of war in Europe, in the Pacific, in Ukraine, in all sorts of other places, seems to me extraordinarily ill-conceived, utterly disastrous. But you can see the kind of pressures that are accumulating and the catalyst towards all kinds of trends that the Ukrainian war is providing. I fully expect Bakhmut to fall to the Russians at some point within the next few weeks. I think it's highly likely that the Russians will capture Vuhledar. When Bakhmut and Vuhledar fall, then it's likely that the Donbass, the rest of the Donbass, will follow. And there's a strong possibility in that case that we would get the Russian army on the east bank of the Dnieper before very long, opposite places like Dnipro and other places, right, in other words, at the heart of Ukraine. And we can see the kind of push and pull that's now going on. The Pentagon becoming increasingly worried that it's diverting resources to this bottomless well, which is Ukraine. The very fact that it's having all of these doubts, inflaming the neocons in Washington who remain fixated with Ukraine, inflaming the president himself, who I think shares neocon obsessions. He, after all, is an elderly man. For him, it's always been Russia which has been the main adversary. He's conscious of China as having emerged over the last few decades, but it doesn't have the kind of visceral force that the old conflict with Russia still does for people of his generation. And you can see how the hardliners in Europe, the Poles, the Balts, and all of the others are also going to become increasingly nervous if the war starts to go wrong and if they sense that the military in the United States is becoming unhappy. And of course, to add to all of this witch's brew, we will probably going to start to see big build-ups by China in the Pacific. And of course, the Russians announced their plans for a massive build-up a few weeks ago, just before Christmas, a long-term build-up of the Russian armed forces. This is all becoming not just Cold War II, it's starting to look like the battle lines for World War III are being drawn. And there doesn't seem to be anywhere in any government any strong voice for peace. One leader, perhaps, is trying to get is developing some sense of how bad things are getting. I read this article a few days ago in the Daily Telegraph, which quotes here a report from Der Spiegel, but I'm going to read the Daily Telegraph's account. Behind closed doors, Mr. Scholz is said to be furious at those who have pushed him to act more quickly. This is about the decision to send tanks. He didn't want to send tanks. He found himself pushed into doing so by the hardliners, both within Germany and within his own government, and of course in NATO. A report in Spiegel magazine this week described a scene in which he vented about the bellicose language of those publicly pushing for battle tank deliveries. These people would soon be calling for fighter jets and troops on the ground, Scholz reportedly claimed. Mr. Scholz and his team insist that his critics are underestimating the likelihood that one force move could end up causing a dreadful escalation in the crisis. Well, Scholz is obviously right, but he's shown no ability up to now to bring this runaway train under control. And one can see how the pressure is going to grow over the next few weeks and months to put the foot down further on the accelerator. There'll be more demands from all sorts of people in the West, in Poland, in Baltic states, in Britain, amongst the neocons in the United States, to deal Russia the knockout blow, to send more military equipment to Ukraine, even as the Pentagon is getting increasingly stressed about this, even as the militaries in Europe, in Germany, and the United States, in Germany and Britain, and by the way, also in France, are getting concerned too. And as this push and pull grows greater, the hardliners will become more strident. Only this morning, I saw a report that the Polish Prime Minister is now openly accusing the Germans of wanting Ukraine to lose. We are looking forward to extremely dangerous times in Europe, in the Pacific, and elsewhere. We will see whether the forces of restraint, people like Mr. Scholz, eventually find the courage to say no. For the moment, the auguries do not look good, and we see, as I said, not just a slide towards a new Cold War, but the battle lines for the next war being drawn. Thank you for joining me in this program today. More from me soon. Please remember that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. If you want to support our work, you can do so through Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And last but not least, please remember that you can buy things, great things in our shop: magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and all of those things. And you can also, if you've liked this video, press the like button and check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today, and more from me soon.